Well, thank you very much for coming to attend another seminar between the London School of Economics and the Fundación Ramón Areces. We are delighted, as always, to partner with the Fundación and have been working with the team at the Fundación in Madrid and the London School of Economics for well over a decade now, with over 700 students coming through our masterclasses in social science in Madrid, and during the pandemic and onwards, online seminars where many thousands of people have managed to attend and view and ask questions to our faculty members about the pressing issues in social science of today. We are grateful for their support over these many years and are delighted to be able to continue this collaboration with two outstanding London School of Economics faculty today. And today's session will focus on artificial intelligence, something that many of us are familiar with as a concept, but few of us are knowledgeable or understand really what happens behind the scenes of how artificial intelligence is helping shape the decisions we make in our lives, and also the way in which data is used to be almost driven into our systems across different platforms and technologies, which make the decision-making of humans increasingly driven by machines and algorithms, datafication, and so on. So there are a huge amount of issues to address when it comes to artificial intelligence and its application in our daily lives. And today we'll explore some of these issues and where we see the future going for artificial intelligence as a tool and as a data-led mechanism for interacting in our daily lives. So first of all, I'd like to introduce Carsten Sørensen, no stranger to the Foundation, a familiar face to many of the students who participated in our joint seminars in Madrid and also online. Carsten is an associate professor in digital innovation at the LSE and undertook his PhD at Aalborg University as in information systems. He's worked with many of the leading digital entities in the world, including Microsoft, Intel, Google, Vodafone, Uber, China Telecom, and many more over a period of his academic career, but also as an academic researcher into many issues around digital transformation of enterprises, digital platforms and infrastructures, and contemporary business operating models using technology. So Carsten, thank you for joining us and welcome back to the Foundation. Professor Andrew Murray is also joining us. He is Professor of Law at the London School of Economics. He is also a visiting professor at the Computer Law Institute in Amsterdam and was also a visiting professor at the École de Droit at Sciences Po in Paris. He was also a specialist advisor to the House of Lords Communications Committee, inquiry into regulating in a digital world, and joining us also as the Deputy Dean of the LSE Law School. So thank you very much indeed for joining us here today, Professor Murray. So Carsten, we're going to start with you. We're going to have some short introductions from your perspectives on artificial intelligence in the world today, and then we will come to Andrew, after which we will encourage a debate between the three of us online today. So thanks again to the Foundation, and Carsten, over to you.
Yeah, thank you very much for this opportunity to the Foundation and to you, Adam. But it is, of course, always more pleasurable to be in Madrid. This is the poor second cousin. The topic, however, is always important. And I have 3 points I want to make here. First, I want to talk about, I want to warn, a slight warning. Secondly, I'm going to talk a little bit about what I see AI as the substance of it. And thirdly, I'm going to talk very briefly about how we may go about controlling it. So the first argument is really just to take Yuval Harari's argument from the 21 lessons in the 21st century book, where he says we have 3 fundamental challenges as humanity. One is the environmental crisis. The second is the proliferation of nuclear weapons and other weapons of mass destruction. And the third one is the digital transformation of society. And whereas the 2 first are only bad, the third one is both good and bad. And that makes it a lot more difficult to handle because we can always find advantages as well as risks. So I think this is the most important thing to be aware of when we start. And one of the biggest dangers in AI, I think, is that we place too much emphasis on its positive sides without and naively assume it can solve our problems while not understanding exactly how. Secondly, I think the most important thing to be aware of when we talk about what AI is, it really is just a very clever set of mechanisms by which we can apply the increasingly amounts of digitized data from all sorts of aspects of society. So the key to understanding AI is to understand that we have now amassed a huge amount of digital data that we can explore in various ways. And this and the way to understand that is really to look at the history of AI. So in the beginning of AI in the 1980s, when I was a master's and undergraduate student, was to really think about expert systems. So expert systems basically took structured data in structured databases. So we had name, address, all the what people had purchased, and then we could use statistical methods to try and understand that data. The next level is what you can call machine learning, which is you use statistical techniques, standard statistical techniques to understand unstructured data, but it requires of us to understand the labels, the categories, and to make those work on understand their relationships through statistical methods. And the most modern kind of AI is probably the one that is mostly promoted, and that is what you can call deep learning. And that's one where there are no categories. The categories are discovered by the algorithms through interactive measurement of the data, by manipulating the data in various ways. I think what's really important to understand here is that still by far the most common form of what you can call artificial intelligence is really just applying statistical techniques to discover patterns in large data sets. And also what's really important to understand is that much of the power that AI has been imbued with in the media, it comes from this kind of process in very limited domains. So we can have AI beat chess masters, they can beat in the game Go, they can beat poker players. And the problem here is that all of these domains are closed worlds, that we all have a clear idea of the outcome. What is absolutely the case is when AI has been let loose on a much more open domain, such as cancer care, or it's like really complex domains where there are not a clear possible outcome measure, what is success and what is failure, then AI has in many cases failed. So this is still an exploration of how can we use it for meaningful things where it is not only a closed worlds where we know exactly what parameter we are dealing with. Now, the third point in my argument is here. So how do we control it? So there's a famous book called Superintelligence, which basically argues that if we are not careful, we cannot control it. And it basically argues there is no way we can control it safely, and we are all doomed. That is an interesting academic argument. It is not true, in my view, because the core of the problem of managing AI is that the most dominant view on how AI should be understood, it is a black magic box. So it is a black magic box with a big button on that says solve all the world's problems. And the whole idea is that all we need is to trust the engineers to build this black box so it is truly brilliant inside, but we don't know what it is. And when we need the problem solved, we just press the button and presto, everything is solved. This is a completely wrong way of looking at it. And the way to look at it is a relationship between the humans and the AI. That's the only way to understand it. And this is described well in a recent book from 2019 by Stuart Russell, who's one of the world's leading AI researchers, who basically argue that instead of having a magic black box where you just push the button and then magic happens, we need to think about this as an ongoing relationship where the AI needs to be incentivized to constantly want to understand what is our aim. So the argument against the black box is, if we ask AI to solve our manufacturing problems of making paper clips, then the AI might decide to spend all the world's resources making paper clips. And we then realize this is not what we wanted anyway. So the problem we have is what we want is not something that is defined up front. What we want is something that is constantly being shaped. And that's why the AI needs to engage in a close relationship with us. Now, the main problem we have in that is, of course, that we end up shaping our own behavior. So Tim Cook, the CEO of Apple, gave a speech some years ago where he says the biggest dangers of AI is that it turns us into robots, not that the AI is the robot. So I do that every time I go flying. I used to be able to sort of cheat a little bit by having one suitcase that was heavier than the others. And I would just put the last heaviest suitcase on at the end, and I would be told off. And I would say, I'm sorry, it will never happen again. Now, the airline companies have a robot. It's called a scale. It weighs how much my suitcase weighs. And if it's more than 500 grams too heavy, then it just says you can't check in. So what happens? I behave like a robot. I weigh before my suitcase, and I don't have one that's too heavy. So the problem here is we need to understand the relationship, the ongoing relationship between computer agency and human agency. And we need to find the right marriage of these two. And that is how we should do it. And the point is here, we need to be safe in leaving control to the machinery. And the point is there, we are not even going to notice how this is going to happen. In the old days, we would only be able to start a car by putting a crank in the front of the car. Then we found a way of starting a car with a key. Now I start my car having the key in my pocket, then I press a button. The point is here, is that AI or not? Well, it's just a clever machinery that understands my intent, that when I press the button, it starts. And we can move that, of course, further and further. So if we see that this one example of this symbiosis can be illustrated by Tesla. Sorry, I just have to see how much time. I have 2 minutes left. I didn't want to go over 10 minutes. So what is Tesla doing? So Tesla has 1 million cars on the road. Each car is a sensor that can sense the environment. So people at Tesla's headquarters now, I think in Texas, they can send out an experiment to the car and say, just go and look for stop signs. And then all these stop signs are recorded and then pushed back to a server in Texas. And then Tesla employs 1,000 people that only labels these signs and other experiments. So they employ a huge amount of people to try and understand how to help the AI learn, so that when future Teslas, they will be able to recognize stop signs, even if they have dirt or snow on them. And this is a very good example that the AI itself can do amazing things, but we have to make it help it understand the parameters. And one of the best examples of how big data and AI can really change how we perceive the world is what's called GPT-3, which is really a general purpose AI that is being trained on a huge amount of data. So you can go online and try it yourself, and you can ask it in text to paint a picture with a cat riding a unicycle, and it'll give you as many pictures as you want that all are different on this. So it's sort of a tool to help us understand our own creativity. And just think of that just a few years ago, it would be impossible. Just think of a few years ago, it would be absolutely impossible to think that we could just talk to our computers and our computers would understand at least sometimes what it is we wanted. And now everybody goes and talks to their computers all the time. This was a problem that people tried to solve for literally decades and never found anything close to a solution. But the availability of internet and smart handsets in our phones, plus these cloud services that can crunch large data amounts, can suddenly make this service that before would just be a dream is now just ordinary. And kids these days don't even think, I'm so old, I still think it's magic. So I think in the future of AI, we can only control it if we manage to engage in a really deep interaction with it and not only leave it as a black box. And I will leave it to Andrew to help unpack some of the intricacies in this, because this is going to be complex and we're going to need people like Andrew to help understand it.
Right. Well, thank you, Carsten. I'm going to see what I can unpick from that. So the first thing I'm going to say is I'm delighted that Carsten referred to magic. In 1962, Arthur C. Clarke set out his 3 laws, the third of which was any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. And this is the problem. We don't understand it, so we treat it in the same way that people in the 15th or 16th century would treat alchemy or any other kind of magical action. But the truth is, AI is not magic. As Carsten has just said, it's technology, and we need to think about it as technology. It works by access to vast data sets. That's how it works. The more data it has, the smarter it looks. Doesn't mean the smarter it is. I always say AI is terribly A and not very I. And the reason for this is because all it is doing is it's drawing data from bigger and bigger libraries. So if we think about this as a human, if in 1992 I asked you who won the 1972 Eurovision Song Contest, assuming you didn't just know the answer off the top of your head, there's nothing you could have done about it. You'd have had to wait until you could have got to the library or got home and consulted your Encyclopedia Britannica or whatever else. Now it's a matter of seconds in your smartphone to find out that it was ABBA with Waterloo. And you can find that out straight away. Now, the fascinating thing is, does that make us any smarter? Are we now smarter than we were in 1992? No, because I caught Carsten nodding slightly there and I lied. It was not ABBA with Waterloo. That was 1973. It was actually Vicky Leandros and Après Toi in 1972. So we're not getting smarter and we're only as good as the data sets that we have. If somebody gives you the wrong data, it's still wrong. Now, the reason that many people may have agreed with me when I said with such authority that it was ABBA is there is an authority bias. We believe what the person tells us if they have this authority position. There's also a technology bias. We believe what technology tells us. There may be a sketch you may have seen called Computer Says No, which was a sketch from a British sketch show in the 1990s and 2000s, which shows how people don't question what a computer says because the computer can't get it wrong, can it? It's got to be right. So we have this problem. We have AI that we think is magic, that we think is always right, that we think always gets the right decision, but all it is really is a really vast data set, and it's only as good as the data that goes in. Garbage in, garbage out, as is often said. So what does this mean for us as lawyers? Well, lawyers are grappling with AI, and I'm going to look at it in two ways. One way is lawyers think that AI is a technological solution to a current problem. The current problem is that there is too much dispute and too much court time being taken up. How can we make the courts more efficient? We need to find a way to streamline justice. And this is being done at the moment. There's a big process in England and Wales to try and streamline the process of access to justice and access to the courts. It's also something very important for legal practitioners through the activity of something called law tech, the streamlining of legal advice through the application of technology. This I will call the code is law discussion. I'll come to in 1 second. The other thing is how we actually regulate AI. So this is something that's being grappled with currently very heavily at the European Union level, but is also in the current government programme at the UK post-Brexit as well. And that is the regulating AI problem. So very briefly, because I've got about 6 minutes, very briefly to look at both of these. The code is law question. So code is law comes from a book written in 1998 by a US law professor called Lawrence Lessig, called Code is Law, I've actually forgotten now.
It's called Code.
Law and Code, thank you. And so the argument of code is law is essentially that we can use software code to regulate people's activities. Now, there is another argument from a Dutch legal academic called Maria Hildebrand called law is code. Now, there, what she argues is that law has always been written in code. The code it's written in is human readable code, it's language. So when we think about law, it's text, it's words on a page. And how do we interpret it? We use humans who are trained to interpret it. We call these humans lawyers. And these humans go through 4 or 5 years of law school, they go through a training process, and at the end of the day, they can understand the magic runes. They can understand them and interpret them for ordinary humans. And this is an important and well-paid job. But if law is just human readable code, well, humans are lazy, humans are prone to errors, humans are expensive, as I've already said. Anybody who's ever had to employ a lawyer knows this. Humans You know, they have inbuilt biases that humans have. They have mistakes. So why not get rid of the humans and replace them with AI? So this is the Law Tech program. And next week, I'm meeting with people from the UK government who are working on their program called the Digital Transformation of Regulation Program. And they're going to explain to me, as they've told me in the little pack that they have sent me, that we will harness technology to ease the burdens of engaging with regulation, and we will work to convert UK business legislation into machine-readable data to drive development of reg tech applications. At the heart of this is a new database of all UK regulations affecting business. Enriched with additional data, it makes it easier to understand regulations in context. We don't need lawyers. The machines will tell us what the law is. This is a move to something that is called algoreg, or algorithmic regulation. Take humans out of the loop and replace them with algorithms as much as possible. It's seen to be efficient because computers make decisions more quickly than humans. It cuts through the errors that humans make. Machines don't get tired. They can work 24 hours a day. They will quite happily work on public holidays like the Queen's Jubilee, and they won't ask for extra pay or anything else. And they don't get tired just before lunchtime, as sufficient analysis of judicial decision-making shows, and they don't make different decisions after lunch when their blood sugar levels are replenished. So this is seen to be better. It's also seen to be fair and just. Every decision is a cookie cutter decision. The computer will make the same decision every time. So it doesn't matter who the person is, you will have justice. This is very strongly driven by people like Richard Susskind, who is a reformer, legal technology reformer, who believes that technology can replace much of the everyday actions of lawyers and judges. So this is one aspect of AI and the law, the codification of law, the replacement of human interaction with human machine interaction. But what it does through is it cuts through the complexity of the human interaction. The other side is the role of lawyers and regulators in controlling and regulating AI and machine learning and other smart systems. And this, at the moment, is very much the focus of the European AI Act, or Draft AI Act at the moment. We tend here to focus on risk. AI is risky somehow. Well, yeah, as Carsten said, it could be risky, but there's also benefits to it. So let's think about this. So what the AI Act tries to do is categorize risk. We've got unacceptable AI. These are things which will exploit vulnerabilities or which use subliminal techniques, and also social credit scoring systems and remote biometric identification of individuals, except in very limited cases. These things will not be allowed in Europe. There is then what they call high risk or critical infrastructure AI. These are things like transportation, power supply grids, water supply, education, vocational training, law enforcement, health, and a number of other areas. They have to do risk assessments before they can use their AI, and they have to show that they meet safety standards that will be put in place by standards regulators. And then there's limited risk systems. They will have transparency obligations. They are things like chatbots, so that you will know when you're chatting to a person from, let's say, Amazon, that it's not a real person, but a chatbot. And you will have that transparency requirement. They will have to say, hi, I'm Tom, and I'm a chatbot, kind of thing, so that you know what you're dealing with. But everything else is unregulated AI, what they call minimal risk AI. And this includes everything else. It includes AI-enabled characters in video games. It includes spam filters, and it includes much of the systems that are used by platforms to regulate how content is delivered to us. But I think they've kind of got the whole target wrong here. To me, biometric identification is high risk, yeah, but it's very rarely going to impact on me on a day-to-day basis. But how I engage with people on Facebook or how I engage with people on Twitter, that's every day. To me, the high risk stuff is not the stuff that I encounter irregularly, but with high impact. It's all, well, it is high risk, but it's also the stuff that I encounter repeatedly at low impact. Because as Carsten says, and this is my last point, it turns us all into robots. We all stop thinking for ourselves, and we all believe that ABBA won the 1972 Eurovision Song Contest because that's what our Twitter feed tells us. So challenges from both sides.
Well, I'd further add that not only that, it tells us to be really angry about ABBA winning in the wrong year, because there's more clicks and engagement in anger than in measured debate. Yes.
Yeah. It polarizes. Twitter
right.
especially polarizes. Yeah.
That's right.
It does. I think, well, thank you very much indeed, gentlemen, for that fantastic overview of the subject matter. Can I pick up where you left off, Andrew, really, because perhaps to demonstrate, either of you, some of what you were mentioning, the everyday use behind which massively powerful AI and data sets are being used in increasing sophistication, and the more users and the more interactions, the more sophisticated that AI becomes in terms of targeting and manipulating, if we could use a strong word, to the behavior of consumers or others, both from a private and a public sector. But perhaps some more examples or some ideas, some understanding of the everyday tools that we take for granted now, actually how the processes behind those, and increasingly so, are being driven by AI. Either of you to comment.
I'm going to jump in first, because I know Carsten will give much more intelligent sort of commentary on the technology and how it's used. But one or two things that I think is really interesting for me as a lawyer, before Carsten then gives the really detailed technical answers, is that, first of all, I mean, AI is a very amorphous term. It could cover a number of things. So I'm going to, for a second here, talk about what you might call algorithmically assisted decision-making, or using algorithms to present data. So, I mean, the most obvious everyday thing that we encounter, which really does influence us massively, is Google search. Google search learns from this massive database of searches that Google gets to try and predict exactly what you're looking for. And I'll tell you what, to be fair to Google, pretty damn good. I mean, think about how infrequently you go to the second page of Google search. Essentially, if you're not on the first page of Google search, now you don't exist almost, as far as the internet is concerned, because Google got very good at predicting what people are looking for. But what it means is that Google very much directs me to my experience, especially of the online world, but even offline as well. So if if you're in somewhere new and you're looking for a restaurant, you might just type into Google, where do I find good Indian food? And Google will tell me, and they will probably send me to a really good Indian restaurant. But there may be one round the corner, which is even better. But because I just ask Google, I never find out. So it influences us online and offline. And the other one, really, as Carsten was alluding to, is that platforms that want to keep our eyes on them, they will prioritize things that are going to get us to engage. So the platforms like Twitter and Facebook, Meta and others, they're going to prioritize in our feed things that are going to get us to click, things that are going to get us to comment, things that are going to, and as Carsten says, we respond more easily to things we disagree with than to things we agree with. And this is part of the big problem, I think personally, of the polarization of politics that you see in the US, you see in the UK, the so-called culture wars that are building around those. And we're also seeing in other countries as well. Other countries are not immune. We saw it in the recent French presidential elections. I think it's worse in English language online, but I think it's also going through to other languages, to French, to Spanish and elsewhere. But yeah, I'm sure Carsten has things to add to that as well.
Yeah, so I think the first thing I would say is that I would always argue that some of the most powerful uses of artificial intelligence are ones that are mundane and we don't necessarily notice them. So it's many, many years ago that people would start writing about the incredibly important use of expert systems whenever there was a snowstorm at an airport. And so the point is that you have a snowstorm and the planes get stuck in various places. No single human or group of humans would ever be able to understand how do we best get all the planes back on track, sorry, the language again. And the point is here, so then this is what AI is very good at. It's to solve a limited problem within a limited space of time. I say, so what is the optimal solution of getting all of these planes in the right place so everybody gets delayed, but then at least we are back on track again. And a good example of, in a sense, how not to do it is in my home country, Denmark, where the underground there is completely ruined by AI or by just a digital system. So there's an underground system across all of Copenhagen. If one door malfunctions in one train, then all the trains are standing still, because the whole system is meant to be deterministically connected. Whereas the London Underground is run by a lot of humans who can make discretionary small decisions. And I think that relates to your arguments, Andrew, as well, in the Lawrence Lessig's code is law and law is code argument, is exactly that a purpose of human actors in this system is to offer discretion, is to say there are situations where we are not all the same. This is what's called the Procrustes paradigm. That Procrustes, a Greek chap who wanted everybody to have the same length, they would sleep in the Procrustes bed. So those who are a bit too tall, they had bits sawn off their legs to fit his bed. And those bits would be used to fit, so those who were too short would have stumps of other people's legs added in the end, so we're all the same. AI will maybe make it look like we are all being treated individually, but there will be a system behind it, making us all fit. I think one of the things that's really important to be aware of here, which is my area, is that we are building a world of digital stuff. So the best way of looking at this is it is unpredictable, because you can mix and match these systems together. If a train company also buys an electricity company and a water company, they have 3 different companies. Whereas when Google, they bought Waze, an Israeli startup that made systems to help you find your way in traffic, it took literally a matter of a couple of weeks before all the Waze data was completely integrated in Google Maps. So one of the huge advantages of this technology is that any service can be easily connected with any other service, and to make something entirely new and better. But that also means for regulators, I think would be my concern, for regulators and lawmakers, this is really difficult because the world is moving so fast. And I would then ask you, Andrew, whether you think it's problematic that the EU is trying to to bureaucratize the management of something that is developing at a pace. So how would you think about this as a law expert?
Yeah, I mean, okay, so there's 2 things to pick up on there. Before I even get to your second question, Carsten, and I'm not going to forget it, about is this bureaucratizing the regulation. There is a primary question behind the markets and integration, the point you made there about the Google purchases. So we also saw it at the EU level in discussing, when the EU discussed the takeover by Facebook, now Meta, of WhatsApp. And the integration of WhatsApp. And of course, they made an undertaking to the European Union that, oh no, don't worry, WhatsApp data will be kept separate. And it was kept separate for about 3 or 4 years. And then slowly, what they said is, well, our systems are being evolved, and now it's completely pointless to try and keep 2 separate systems. So by accretion, the data will fold in. So part of the problem around it is that regulators have misunderstood data digital markets. So our competition law is completely out of date. Competition law steps in where there is seen to be some kind of market manipulation or market harm. Now, this is taken to be, generally speaking, the shorthand for it is price. If the market price is being manipulated, then there is some kind of market harm or market abuse going on, so the competition regulators will step in. But of course, the price of WhatsApp is the pricely sum of £0 per year. The price of Facebook is the pricely sum of £0 per year. How can this be bad for the consumer? The consumer is getting things for free. This is fantastic. And this is because we don't account for data as a cost in our current markets. So now we're all scrambling to account for data. So we have the Digital Markets Act in Europe. We have the proposal in the Queen's speech for a new Competition and Markets Digital Services Unit, which is already in shadow form up and running in the UK, and the idea of realizing that markets are more than just money markets. So now, only now, about 10 years after it should have been, competition law is starting to catch up. In the gap of competition law functioning between 2010 and 2022, what has happened is these massive data conglomerates have emerged. So Meta and Facebook are certainly the 2 largest, but we also have other massive data conglomerates as well, like Microsoft, fairly obviously. Apple is the other one, is usually in that group. But then, you've got to remember that Tesla's market value is not built on the number of cars they sell. They sell a reasonable number of cars, but nothing compared to General Motors, for example. Tesla's market value is entirely on the data that it accretes through all of its data points that are out there in the world. So there has been a move in the gap of competition law to fill it with other things. So as far as Europe is concerned, 3 things are filling it, and we're seeing a similar thing happening in the UK. The first is the pre-existing digital privacy law, which becomes GDPR, or the General Data Privacy Regulation from 2018 onwards, which provides quite a complex regulatory system around gathering, processing, holding data. The second is the draft AI Act, which is going to try and basically deal with AI as if it were a consumer good, like a washing machine or a fridge, and say, well, we can put a big sticker on the side of it and say this is category A AI and therefore is good, or this is category E AI and is therefore bad. I'm being slightly critical. I just don't think that the people who decide whether washing machines are good or bad are the same people to decide whether AI is good or bad, but that's kind of where we are at the moment with the people involved. And we have the twins of the Digital Services Act and the Digital Markets Act, which are designed to try and capture the platforms. So yeah, the answer is to try and build systems. We're trying to systematize the regulation, because we believe that these companies, these big data companies and platforms, will seek out loopholes. So we try to close all the loopholes before they can be found. And it becomes, as far as I'm concerned, very much a tick box exercise. So these companies, they employ more regulatory experts. Facebook, Meta have more people working in their regulatory teams than the European Commission has. Google have more people in their regulatory teams than the UK government have in their equivalent regulators. And so what's happening is that it's mechanical Turk. There are thousands of lawyers working in Meta and thousands of lawyers working in Google and others who are doing the mechanical Turk job of ensuring that they comply with the regulators. And it's not actually what you would call objects-based regulation. It's not outcomes-based regulation. It's simply process-based regulation. And the only people who are winning in this are the people who are employed by Meta and Facebook in their regulatory teams, or Google and others, and the government of Ireland, which is making a huge amount of money out of Dublin Bay. And everyone else is basically in a compliance mode. And the trouble is that the compliance models that we build are for the world as they are today, and they're not really very well built. They're not future-proofed, and there's not enough horizon scanning being done by regulators, in my view. So yeah, and one last thing is that, of course, then we end up with what's called the Brussels effect. The standards that are set, GDPR Brussels effect, the standards that Brussels set become the tick box exercises that other governments do as well, because they want to trade with Brussels. And so we get this not very, in my view, not very good regulation, therefore then exported to other parts of the world as well. So yeah, it's bureaucracy, but then if I was being slightly critical, not at all being a Brexiteer in any way, shape or form, Brussels has always been about bureaucracy. And it kind of does reflect that commission approach, shall we say.
Let me again pick up there, Andrew. Thank you so much for that, and Carsten. But let's take that example where, as a reference, let's say Brussels and its process, long, bureaucratic, but nonetheless comes up with some quality outputs, one would hope, in the field to try and manage and regulate these areas, and it will be the least worst possibly outcome that will be used internationally as a reference point. And therefore, if you want to trade with the European Union, you need to have the similar standards. But to challenge that slightly, to say that in other countries outside of Europe, where in the public sector, the regulation of the power of artificial intelligence used by the public sector is perhaps less distinct or less regulated in a way that can be building up huge amounts of data sets, as you said, facial recognition, behavior recognition, that can be put through systems that would probably not make it through the Brussels effect or the system, but nonetheless are becoming increasingly powerful. And again, not just manipulation, but the collation of data for government purposes. So perhaps we could look more broadly and some comments on other jurisdictions, let's say, because I know that's of interest to some of the LSE alumni community that we reached out to before this talk. to understand not only from our not Eurocentric position, I would say, but certainly from an international perspective as LSE is, but also that the jurisdictions and the capabilities and abilities to harness AI in other countries is not the same as it is in most of the Western or European ones or other countries around the world. So a few comments on that, because that became an area of interest as we reached out to the global alumni community around this topic.
I think that probably invites me to lead off and maybe Carsten to come in. So I think the starting point is that as you hear, I am critical of Brussels and London as well. I don't think the Westminster's doing a better job either in basically providing a model for how to regulate in this space. However, to be a little bit more recognizing that they're doing something. At least there is movement in Brussels, and there is movement in London and other places. And where Brussels is giving lead is they're the first place that I'm aware of globally to actually have published a full draft AI regulation model in this way. There's discussions in other places, but Brussels were the first one to put it out there and say this is what the whole act will look like. In other parts of the world, there is simply no regulation. So you have a completely deregulated sector. There is also in many places, one thing that Brussels is very good at doing, and London not too bad, is the recognition that public sector applications of technologies are likely to be more high risk and more harmful than private sector applications, accepting our previous conversation about the data masters like Google and Meta and others. And that for most people, the most harmful interaction with technology is in public sector decision-making. So it may be around decision-making around access to something like immigration decisions or housing decisions or payment of benefits or something similar, or it will be in the law enforcement environment, such as the application and deployment of facial recognition technology or the application and deployment of other kinds of enhanced law enforcement investigatory tools. So at least in Europe, the public application of these will fall under the same regime, excepting in a few limited exceptions for law enforcement as the private application. In other parts of the world, there is, it seems to me, and I admit that I'm getting out of my knowledge zone here because I really know about the European UK position. In other parts of the world, there is more public application of AI tools. Again, essentially, oftentimes because of the efficiency savings. And a really good way to make strong efficiency savings in public sector is to replace a police officer with a smart camera, replace a decision maker with an automated system. There is a relatively high upfront cost of building the system, but then a very low ongoing cost of being able to maintain the system thereafter. So there is a danger that the use of AI tools and automated decision making are seen to be beneficial in terms of public resource and public purse, but are also seen to be beneficial in terms of you can't bribe an AI, you can't make an AI look a different way. The AI should theoretically be a completely objective eye watching what people are doing, and therefore it has this degree of, if you will, being both objective and permanent. But the danger with this, and I'll say this, and I'm sure Carsten's got things to add, the danger with this is that we end up with the concept of the kind of Foucauldian surveillance society. Everywhere we go, we are unaware of when we may or may not be being observed. We have a truly digital panopticon. And so the risk is that everybody's behavior becomes roboticized as a result. And so I think the one good thing about maybe the Brussels effect is if it does cause other governments to have to then consider how they use these technologies to be able to trade with the EU, then there's a long discussion about whether this is some kind of sort of positive leadership from what we might call the kind of intellectual West, or whether this is some kind of modern version of digital colonialism. And there are arguments both ways, it can be said.
Okay.
Yeah. So at a conference many years ago, there's a payments and privacy expert called David Birch, who is a very interesting person. He made a point that stuck with me for years, which I would now unpack, which is that private companies, they are less dangerous than the national state, because the private companies only have one interest, is to sell you things, whereas the state has got more nefarious purposes with you if it really wants to. Now, the point is here, I would argue, as I do every time I do executive work, I would say I have mostly studied the private sector, but increasingly the private sector will have more and more characteristics of the public sector and vice versa. So I'm a citizen of Facebook, and that means that I somehow I have to be treated a little bit like a citizen by Facebook. There's a limit to how much they can violate my rights. On the other hand, the increasingly new public management means that the public sector is looking at me as a customer, as a consumer, and sometimes forget that I'm also a citizen. And so this kind of merger makes it a distinction that's too harsh between the public and private sector very dangerous. And also, of course, in some authoritarian regimes, there are very complex relationships between the private and public sector, and in particular with big tech. So I think it's a really complicated thing, and AI has this bridging capacity. Now, in the mid 1960s, there was a very famous Danish computer science professor called Peter Nauer. He argued in the public media and had some effect to say that when the public sector have got all these databases of structured data on its citizens, there should be guardrails for how it could just put these pieces of data together. And I think in a way we have that regulation in most countries, but as technology is racing ahead, we have found out that there are new ways we can use this data, so social network credit scoring and all sorts of things, and that means we might need to change how we think about this. And I think the most important thing is exactly that the data is not, and the systems are not neutral. I would ask anybody who think the data is neutral to go on Google and just write Amazon. What do you get? You get lots of pictures of the Amazon logo. If you want to see the Amazon, you have to write the Amazon. Then you will get only one Amazon logo and then lots of pictures of the Amazon rainforest. And it used to be so. I did the experiment several years ago. If you wrote CEO, it will only be men. If you wrote cleaner, it would only be women. But of course, now Google has turned out to be slightly more politically correct, so it's on purpose biasing. So you do get a more equal. Actually, the Chinese search engines are slightly more gender neutral in that sense. So I think that the huge problem we have here is the unpredictability, the unforeseen-ness. So I would normally use the quote about the unknown unknowns from the Iraqi briefing by Donald Rumsfeld. That the problem we have now is we are legislating, and that would be my next question to you, Andrew. We are legislating in a world where not only is the technology moving, but how it is recombined across sectors, across use cases is exploding. So so I understand that the GDPR, the privacy regulation, is in many ways a lot simpler than AI regulation. So if you could just try and give me the 101 comparison of how monumentally a challenge is the new AI regulation for the EU.
Yeah. So we've got what, 5 or 6 hours for this talk. But I mean, so a couple of things to start with. I'm going to come back to that because every time I get a question from you, Carsten, I always want to go back to something you've said just before as well, which is this breakdown of the public-private is very, very important for lawyers because there's always been a distinction between what you would call public law and private law. And public lawyers look at constitutional aspects of law, private lawyers mostly look at business and personal relationships. But this is becoming very blurred. And, with maybe 1 or 2 exceptions, no governments build their own AI systems. They're too complex, they're too costly, they don't have the skill set, they don't have the economies of scale. So anything they're buying from the private sector. And the private sector often are also sharing data with the government and vice versa. I mean, there's current litigation going on at the moment about data sharing between the NHS and Google, which was allegedly, according to the people who are making the claim, was done without the agreement or permission of the people whose data was shared. It involves the Royal Free Hospital and in Google's sort of medical DeepMind technology. So this is a typical example of this public-private issue. Now, an issue for lawyers is that when we think about, for example, fundamental rights and human rights, the Human Rights Act involves what's called a vertical enforcement of rights. So I can enforce my rights against the state because the state owes me a duty to protect my human rights, but I can't enforce it against Carsten because Carsten and I don't owe each other human rights duties. Or more importantly, I can't directly enforce it against Google because Google is a private citizen, not a public body. So there is this issue of verticality and horizontality in that when public sector organizations are using private sector outsourcing or are using private sector data or private sector systems, getting at the problem is very difficult. You might be able to claim an action against, let's say, the Department of Health, but that's not getting at Google's algorithm because Google's algorithm is in the private body. So we have this real problem that they are connected. In a sense, this is why GDPR is easier to construct than, for instance, the AI Act, because the GDPR really takes two principles. One, that there's a fundamental right in data privacy. And this is involved in the EU Charter, and it's Article 8 of the EU Charter, says you have a right to your personal data privacy. It then attaches it to this concept of this legal person that we call the data subject, which are any identifiable person within the European Union or European Economic Area, and who is alive, essentially. And it creates a kind of personal right. So it creates a connection between a person and a piece of data. Now, when that piece of data then goes around the world, as long as we remain attached to it, as long as we are identifiable, we can complain to the regulator, or we can talk to the data controller and say, this is my data, tell me what you're doing. I think what you're doing is incorrect. I want you to stop this. So in essence, there's a connection between the artifact and a human. And that human has an interest in that artifact, which they can then describe to a regulator by a challenge or a claim or something. The problem with regulating AI is we're really here regulating more of a concept. We're trying to actually define regulation for decision making in essence, but decision making, as you said right at the start, Carsten, through the large scale operation of databases that are growing bigger and bigger all the time. I mean, these data sets are, they're approaching trillions of points of data that are in them now. And the idea here is we're trying to capture in any kind of description elements of what types of AI we don't want to have, or we only want to have in specific categories. And this is why we go to risk. And this is why we have this risk regulation model. But there's two problems with risk regulation. One, we've discussed at length, which is that it doesn't really capture the low risk, repetitive kind of influence of AI that makes you change the way that you travel by air. And secondly, it doesn't capture, or it can't capture yet, the kind of horizon scanning stuff. And they're trying to create an act which is going to be an act for the next 10 to 15 years without really knowing what it is they're regulating. Because much like you and I, they're kind of talking about it in kind of abstract terms. And the problem is, truthfully, it's all in the data. I saw a really fascinating talk by a researcher called Mani Kawembe, who came and talked to us in the school, where he was talking about the way that these open data sets gather data. And the problem with these open data, and Carsten will correct me no doubt in 1 second, the problem with these open data sets is they reflect humanity as a whole. And he had an image that showed an image of Barack Obama. And it was drawn from an open data set. And it was a statistical analysis of what this image represented in terms of natural linguistic search terms. And in terms of the statistics, it did not meet the threshold that this was a picture of the first Black president of the United States of America. It did, though, meet the threshold that this was a picture of the first Kenyan president of America and the first illegal Black president of America, because, of course, the data is drawn on sort of what people type in to open sources, to platforms. And as we talked about earlier, people tend to engage with things more critically than more supportively. So people don't tend to type, hey, that's Barack Obama, the president of America. People type illegal, Kenyan, that's stolen, that kind of thing. So the data becomes polluted from the very start. And that's missing from the AI Act. The data is reckoned to be covered by GDPR, but GDPR only covers personal data, not non-personal or generic data. So nowhere is the data sets being regulated in this. We reckon that by regulating risk, we can regulate AI, but I would argue that the risk that we should be looking for is the low risk stuff. So I don't know if that answers your question, Carsten. It's a bit of an attempt at it.
Very good. Yeah, so I have several other issues, but if you have a burning issue from the LSE alumni network, Adam, please feel free. But otherwise, I have stuff would like to ask.
Yeah, thank you, Carsten. Yeah, we do. As I said, I reached out through the global LSE alumni network, all the heads of alumni in one single WhatsApp group, which is highly unregulated, I should say, completely, and has interesting, valuable data therein. But that represents over 100 countries and 100 LSE alumni heads, which represent over 100,000 LSE alumni spread around the world. So it's been an interesting process. One of the questions that came back, I think, is interesting to sort of do this at this stage, is actually sort of how did we get here? And so some of the roots perhaps of AI in terms of how that started to be produced and moved very quickly into science fiction a long time before it was a reality in a sense, and maybe trying to understand the roots of AI to understand where we are now in terms of the scale and so on. So just a quick comment on that, because I'm very conscious of the time and I'd like to invite you both to wrap up, but just some comments about the journey perhaps that AI has been on and where it may go next would be a good conclusion.
Yeah, so I think having spent over 35 years trying to research the human relationship with digital technologies, I think there's a general technological optimism. And then there's also a general pessimism. So between utopia and dystopia, it's sort of like almost the echo chambers of social network has existed in human understanding of technology. And exactly, so there was a paper back in 1972, the year ABBA didn't win the European Song Contest. There was a paper written by a guy called Bo Shields. So basically argued, it was in the age of expert systems. And so the argument was, any technology, any system that you understand what it does, it cannot be AI. It's just clever software engineering. And so the point is here that technology imbues human aspirations to solve all our problems. It's the technical fix. And there, the technical determinist argument that if you don't jump on the technology train now, you're going to be left behind, and this train is going to fix all our problems. And exactly because AI is often spoken about in the media wrongly as though it is this black box with a magic button on that solves all our problems of the environment. And there are many technologies that have the same characteristics attributed to them, like quantum computing, the internet, the book. All of these things, they're like the fact that Mark Zuckerberg's, of course, prime ethos is that as long as we all are connected on Facebook, the world is a better place. The point is here, digital technologies, we have to understand that anything that makes us smarter makes us dumber. Anything that sets us free enslaves us. And digital technologies is the best example of that. So the journey is one that on the surface, there are all these stories about how it will solve all our problems. And underneath the surface, there are ordinary, good, honest software engineers and other practitioners solving practical problems with this technology. And so I think it's important not to get distracted from DeepMind showing all the wizardry, whereas in reality, the greatest impact might be when you want to apply for a mortgage and computer says no, or you go to court and you are wrongly judged of having done something that you have not done, or you are over harshly judged. So I think what's really important is, you could say, as any digital innovation, it is far too important to be left to the geeks alone. Because who says the computer scientists are the best lawyers? It's exactly not necessarily the case. So I think where it's going is, I see a continued flashing of lights of wizardry of GDP 4, 5, 6, 7, GPT 3 and 4 and 5 and 6, showing us all this amazing wizardry, but the real interesting development is when individuals and companies work together. And my biggest fear is the one also explained by Yuval Harari that says, right now we're at a time when if you are being discriminated against, you have a way of understanding it. Whereas once we individualize discrimination, the AI firms will say, well, the algorithm made some choices. I don't know how it made it. It's not my problem. And we generally have this understanding that we try and attribute blame to people, not to algorithms. And so the point is there, once I'm being rejected a mortgage, the algorithm says, but it's you. It's based entirely on a deep understanding of you. So we can't do it. Whereas in the past, you could say, or right now, you can say, well, I'm being mistreated because I'm in this category of people. So I think this individualization of people means that suddenly, if we are not careful, all the false positives will mean I'm not allowed to go in a self-driving car anymore. And I think this is my biggest challenge, but lots of problems can be solved. Andrew, you have the last minutes. Sorry.
Well, no, that's almost impossible to follow, because I mean, I think you've just hit so many things there. So I think, first of all, how are we where we are? I cannot pretend to have the knowledge of the development of AI that Carsten does. But one thing I do see from where I am is that there is a little bit of what I would call tech bro culture, when it is very much the culture of Western Europe, North America, what you might call the most developed nations, etc., is very much the culture of Silicon Valley. It's very much of grow fast or die, move fast and break things, all this kind of stuff, reinventing things using technology. And it's always assumed to be better. I saw something on Twitter last week where some tech guys had invented a new digital clock system that worked using shadows. And below that, the comment was, well done, guys. You've just invented a sundial. And effectively, that's what they had done. But they didn't see that because it was new and it was different. And novelty is very important today, and technology drives a lot of the novelty. So somehow the idea that the technology makes things better has become embedded very much. I have two big concerns. One is technology is making us dumber. I'm not a psychologist. There are some brilliant psychologists who work at the LSE, Sonia Livingston among us, and they will tell you how, kids today, and not just kids, I see it in students, I see it in myself. You read in smaller bite-sized chunks than you used to. It's harder to sit and read for 2 or 3 hours at a time. My mind always wanders to something else, and that's because of the way things are delivered. We've gone from the 2-3 hour film to the 40-minute TV show to now the 10 minutes on YouTube to TikTok. If we can't do it in sort of 55 seconds, we don't want to know kind of thing. And so there is this break of concentration. And I think this is the technology is breaking the ability of us to concentrate. But the biggest issue by a mile is the black box problem. The idea that somehow computer says yes, computer says no, and the computer knows better. And as Carsten says, the more and more that becomes individualized, as our individual data becomes part of this, then it's going to be very, very hard for us to challenge things, because the decision maker will say, well, it made the decision based on the data that was available in the algorithm. We can't challenge that. We can't go into that. Now, GDPR is supposed to protect us from that. There is something called Article 22. And Article 22 says you have the right to opt out of purely automated decision-making. That only works for personal data. It doesn't work if I have 10,000 data points that represent Carsten, but are not Carsten, and I use them to make a decision about Carsten. Then what happens? I make a decision about Carsten. Carsten says, Article 22, automated data. I don't want this decision to be made by a computer. I take the computer decision. I look at it and go, yeah, computer got it right. It's now no longer an automated decision solely by a computer. It now complies with Article 22. But Carsten still hasn't got his loan because he's been dealt with as a data point. And this is my biggest concern, is that this technology is so dehumanizing. We are no longer humans. We're no longer social. We are just data points. And this is happening in a number of areas. And my worry is it's happening in public decision-making, and it's happening, or it will happen, in law as well.
Thank you. Thank you very much. We're out of time already. That just zipped by at a high pace, but I'm enormously grateful, Andrew and Carsten, for that fascinating debate. And I would encourage the listeners and viewers to use this as an example of real intelligence and allow yourself to be manipulated by the argument and the presence of the two faculty members from the London School of Economics in debate and discussions about the opportunities, but the massive challenges that AI is presenting us with as a society, as well as an opportunity for leveraging and resolving difficult problems that can be defined. So once again, thank you very much indeed, gentlemen, and thank you to the Foundation for its continuing over decades-long support of the London School of Economics in every capacity we've managed to collaborate with here and in Madrid and around the world. So thanks again to everyone, and we will see you for the next seminar. Thank you.